Right, afternoon everyone. First of all, thank you for your valuable time today in joining us on our webinar about cybercrime. I'm Simon G. I'm the Business Development Manager here at ACUTEC. And alongside we have Amy here from Marketing.
Hello.
Who organised today's events, and also Irfan, who's our Technical Manager.
Hi everybody.
Right, okay, so I'll crack on straight away. So basically the purpose of today's seminar is to talk about cybercrime and how it can affect our business, focusing specifically on fraudulent activity. So what we've done is we've put together our 7 things to know. So I'm going to basically start off with what exactly is cybercrime and what is the potential threat. So Irfan, can you kind of expand on that first, please?
Yeah, of course, and obviously it's quite a big sphere, cybercrime, so we're going to try and focus on just a certain part of it. Cybercrime is technically any activity carried out online, criminal activity carried out online. So what we're trying to do is focus on fraudulent activity and criminal activity aimed at business, and we will touch on some enterprise businesses, big businesses, but a lot of the focus is also going to be on small and medium-sized businesses because they are the most vulnerable at present. So that's generally an overview of cybercrime.
Okay, and can you give us kind of some specific examples of what you would associate with cybercrime?
Okay, an easy example, a couple of easy examples for me to give you is something called ransomware, which is a type of malware. Malware stands for malicious software. And what ransomware does, it technically holds you to ransom. It disrupts your IT systems or locks your data and then doesn't give you access to it, therefore you can't do any work unless you pay a ransom. So that is ransomware pretty much wrapped in a single explanation there of how it works, and what we need to do is try and protect and mitigate that.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so you mentioned ransomware as an example of a type of cybercrime. What about the targets themselves in terms of, so what is the target essentially?
Okay, well, historically what used to happen is Windows devices used to be the target. 98% of operating systems on servers and PCs were Windows, and that has completely changed in today's world, and now the user has become the target. The actual person has become the target, and why that's happened is because the device might be iPhone, so it's running iOS. It might be an Android phone, so it's running a different piece of software, or it might be actually just you using still a Windows device. So it's not aimed at devices anymore. It's actually aimed at the user, and any device can be used to try and get to the person or the data. And the means of getting to you could be, Simon, simply a real-world phone call. Someone could be calling you up and could be trying to gain information from you to try and get you onto their systems, and you hear a lot of this in the media. It could be via a tablet, an iPhone, as I said. Someone could be trying to engage you via instant messaging and try and get to your systems that way. Actually, it could be social media, trying to gather information from you on social media and therefore trying to get onto your systems. So there could be multiple ways that data and people are accessed.
Okay, so I guess that the question, what is the target, is maybe more of a case of who is the target.
Absolutely.
And I think the fact that we live now in a world where devices there's so many devices, at work we've now got multiple devices per user, and communication is not done just by a typical analog telephone these days. It's much more than that.
Yeah, and the screen at the moment is showing where attacks can be automated, and they can be from anywhere in the world, and criminals are just doing preliminary checks to just see if they can get into a system, if it's got basic security. If it hasn't, then they'll try and attack. If it has, they might move on, or they might go on to a next check. So, it just shows that it could be anywhere in the world, and it could be any type of business.
Okay, brilliant. So it's very much that who is the target. We've identified that's ourselves as much as anybody, as the users. What about what are they trying to get? It was always the case that people wanted data. But there'll also be people out there that say, well, that's fine. I use Word and Excel, and it's not particularly sensitive, things like that. You know, are they still trying to get to our data?
Yes, but what's changed is that that data may not be accessible easily. So therefore, they're trying to get to the person to get to the data. Now, it's quite easy to think, I don't, like you just mentioned, I only use Word or Excel. But recently, both of us visited a watch distributor, and they have their own design team. And they pay the designers a lot of money, and those design files are stored somewhere and are valuable because of the amount of time spent on them. So that's IP. So what we have to do is try and help our clients and our partners protect their intellectual property, which is data. But what people forget is processes. If you have internal business processes that are stored in some form of data, it might be Word documents, it might be templates, a competitor or a startup in Eastern Europe or actually in the Far East, if they can get hold of that, then they have a head start on, and are using your hard work to actually progress. So your data is important. But here's another thing. If your data isn't important to anybody else, and it might not be hacked to steal from you, imagine that data being hacked to stop you getting access to it. And you might think the only people this data is important to is me and my company. Well, the aim is then to stop you having it. Let's hack the data and stop you getting access to it, and that's what ransomware does. It encrypts your own data and then holds you to ransom if you want access to it.
Okay, so going back, you know, very much the fact that our cells are the targets, and they can now get the top possibility of getting into our data, and also that's getting onto our networks, I guess, as well.
Absolutely, but I think it's important to reiterate the type of question you asked earlier, which was, I don't have very sensitive information. They're Word or Excel documents. Okay, they might not be sensitive to anybody else, but they're obviously a requirement for you. And what we're doing is trying to stop them attacking your data and stop you accessing it, so it's important.
Okay, brilliant. So that vulnerability is very much out there. The question is very much, to me, is how are we getting to those people? You know, are we being watched? And that'll be something I think everyone is a little bit nervous about.
Okay, well, are we being watched? Not quite, but it's a valid question. The criminals, cyber criminals' approach is quite strategic, and it's automated. So they have a process that they go through, and what they might be doing is scanning companies and their networks and checking if they've got some basic security. And if you've got basic security, the people who do not want to spend time on trying to get past it will move on. But 20% will then try the next step. Beyond the basic security, do they have any advanced security? And they will keep trying and try to penetrate your network and get into your systems, either by automated systems or identifying what your business does, what data it might hold, and then being more strategic in their approach and actually trying to gather information about you as an individual or as you as a business. So once they do get into your system, it's quite useful, because what they're trying to do is get more specific, detailed information from you. And an example the screen showing now is key logging. If they can get past your primary systems, they might install a piece of software, a piece of malware that logs and records everything you're doing, keystrokes and websites you're visiting. So if you're visiting your Twitter site and are logging into your Twitter site, we've had examples of clients coming to us, customers coming to us and saying, this has happened, and then we've helped them in this situation. And one example might be, you've logged onto your Twitter, you've typed in your password, that password's been recorded, and then someone maliciously has sent out tweets that are actually diminishing your reputation because they're quite offensive in the tweets. Another example might be, you're logging onto your banking software and they're recording the website you're going on to, and actually the keystrokes, it might not be able to get your password completely because you're putting in part of your password, but quite quickly, if they monitor that for long enough, they can try and put together what your password might actually be. So it's quite important to understand once they get in, they are observing. So they aren't watching it. People aren't watching us, but pieces of software could possibly be monitoring what we're doing.
Okay, so yes, you may have come across terms such as malware, and you may have come across keylogging. The one for me that stands out there is keylogging, because essentially that's people being able, or people having software on your system that can essentially see exactly what you're typing in certain areas, and obviously that's passwords, that's very sensitive information. Earlier we mentioned ransomware, we've talked about malware. Another term that's very pertinent at the moment is spearfishing. A typical IT term, what does it mean? So what is spearfishing, Irfan?
Okay, well, if we can start with the original term of phishing, which is really trying to catch somebody out. And phishing is best described as having a very large net and casting it far and wide and trying to see what you can catch in your net. And spearfishing is where phishing has actually evolved. And a picture I can paint is, imagine having a large fish in a bathtub and you're standing over it with a spear. It's quite an easy target. So what's happened is you're not spreading this large net wide and far to see what you can catch. Actually, you've identified the type, what your target is, you've closed them down, and now you've got a very appropriate weapon to try and catch them. So spearfishing is targeting attacks. And how are they achieving it? Is really trying to understand who's in your business. That might be logging onto Facebook, LinkedIn, it might be Twitter, it might be you've done a case study, you might have some media exposure, and finding out this is the FD in the business, the financial director, this is the accounts person, this is the MD, and then trying to spoof communication between those parties to try and get something out of them. I think actually you told me a recent story about a friend you had, Gillian.
Oh yes, yes, I've got a friend called Gillian who works in an accounts department, and her FD regularly sends her emails, and there was a particular one that came through to her regarding payment and saying, "Dear Jill, can you please pay an amount of money to X bank account?" A very, very typical email that she would receive on a daily basis from her FD. The thing that stood out in this case was the fact that it said, "Dear Jill." She really doesn't like being called Jill. Her FD really was almost insulting her. So fortunately she knew this person and very much tackled that, at which her FD didn't know anything about the email, and that was a typical spearfish in that case.
So I would like to highlight that specific case, Simon, because what we're identifying is something slightly out of the norm, and what we have to do is educate the end users. We can put lots of technology in that sometimes works and sometimes can be bypassed, but end user education. Gillian knew her FD wouldn't call her Jill, or actually was upset that he did, so confronted him, and therefore he was able to say, "I didn't send that email." Now you might ask, how was an email be able to send internally to make it look like it was from the FD? Because that's happening a lot, asking for a payment to be made. What people are actually doing, criminals are doing, they're spoofing your email, and that's quite easy to do. You can do a quick Google search and actually spoof anybody's email. I wouldn't recommend any of the listeners do it, but you can quite easily follow some simple steps and pretend to be one of your colleagues. And anybody can do that externally, but what we can do is help you with some basic steps to ensure that doesn't happen internally. I hate to use these acronyms, but implementing stuff like SPS, DMARC and DKIN, these are some simple steps we can help with to stop some of that internal spoofing. What we unfortunately can't stop is or control is the whole World Wide Web, so it's more difficult to stop spoofing from internal sites, but there are some things we can do. On the phishing, I do want to use a case that's quite famous in the IT world. It's for one of the leading IT security companies called RSA, and they provide those little key tags that have the numbers that change continuously. So you can type in, like, and some people might have it for their bank. When they log in, they get a little key number. And they were hacked, and they have openly admitted they are hacked. And if a security firm can get hacked, then you can see how intelligent these cyber criminals are. And what they did was attack by association. So it's important for the listeners to consider who their suppliers are and also who their biggest clients are, because you are not only, if you don't follow security steps to ensure your networks are secure, you're making yourself vulnerable, but you also might be making your suppliers and your customers vulnerable. And what happened in this situation was RSA had some maintenance work going on, and the person responsible for that maintenance work was the operations director. So the criminals were able to identify who that subcontractor was, who was carrying on the maintenance work. They hacked the subcontractor's network. They were able to send an email to the operations director of RSA, who opened that email and clicked a link because it was from someone who he trusted as a genuine email, and infected the RSA network. And the reason, what was later established, is this attack came from China, and because RSA provide the security keys for the Pentagon, that's the ultimate goal. I know this sounds like a really big story in the enterprise world, but it can just show you how spearfishing, targeting that subcontractor, allowed them to get into the main target. Now, I just want the listeners to consider, do they have a very large client or an important client, and might they be the weakest part of the communication channel into that client? So it's just,
I think you've hit a good point there. If I know that, yes, that was a typical scenario at enterprise level. You know, the example that I gave was very much a smaller business side of things, and I think the vulnerability is there. But as we've mentioned, things like spearfishing, like key logging, like ransomware, you know, I guess there'll be people out there possibly listening here, maybe not, but they might be saying, right, well, we've got antivirus software, and we have an anti-spam solution in place. We've also invested in a firewall. Are these people safe, in your opinion, Irfan?
I think we need to, as the slide suggests, we need to flip the question on its head. It's not only about what security you have in place, it's about finding the vulnerabilities and finding the holes. So the technologies you've mentioned, some of the listeners may or might not be familiar with them, so I'll go over them very high level. A firewall is a really important part of a secure network. It sits at the outside, the perimeter. Think of it like a fence or the gates at the front, and that stops the bad guys coming in, so it's important to have. Antivirus is something, if anybody gets into the network, it protects the individual server or the PCs. Anti-spam protects any nasties getting in from email, so these are important tools to have. But as I mentioned earlier, there are intelligent pieces of software that can now scan your networks and see if this is in place. And if it is in place, then they're looking to find other holes. And sometimes the weakest point is the user, and that's why I keep referring back to end user education to make sure that they are not the weakest point. If you work in accounts and you're getting an email from FedEx, or that looks like FedEx, to say you're getting a delivery, you don't normally deal with deliveries, that's normally in warehouse. Do not open that email. If you normally work in the warehouse and you have an email from company's house about some account information, do not open that email, because that's not normally something you would do. So it's important to inform the end users that they should follow certain basic common sense protocols, but it's also about seeing if there is any vulnerabilities. Ask yourself, we have antivirus, but do we keep it up to date? We have a firewall. Have we applied the latest security patches? Because the threat is quite dynamic.
Okay, that's excellent. So, you know, you spoke a lot about perhaps the user side of things from there, and I think something we should be, perhaps as organisations, I'm sure you have policies right throughout the business in certain cases, and I think IT policies, having them in place, but also refreshing them and re-informing users is equally as important. Let's just spin it onto the actual infrastructure side of things. What can we do to kind of make sure we're always as up to date as we possibly can from that extent.
Okay. I think it's important to have some basics in place, and I will go over that. And I've got Amy's prepared the next slide for this. I just want to focus on the fact that we can't cover all the bases all of the time. The environment's quite dynamic, and if you see the slide now, it's actually pointing out in the last 2 years there's been a 73% rise in unique malware attacks. That means this is something brand new we are seeing. So there's only so fast everybody can react. So we are trying to take proactive steps, all IT firms are, to try and mitigate this risk, but we have to, side by side, ensure end users are educated and IT policies are up to date and easy to understand. So what I would like to do is then move on to the next slide and actually go through some of the basics that you should have in place. You mentioned, and I briefly spoke about Firewall. I would ask each of our listeners to possibly download this checklist or ask Amy for it, or happy to have a conversation about it, and just check, do I have a firewall in place? That's like your front gate, your fence. It protects everything inside your network by building a fence around it.
I would like to add to that as well, is the age of something like firewalls can also be a very important factor as well.
It can, you're absolutely right, because what a firewall from 3 years ago might be doing is inspecting each bit of data that's coming in, but actually the new firewalls are x-raying those bits of data and making sure there isn't anything hidden inside of the data. So it's quite appropriate for you to mention having an up-to-date firewall. I would say ask you to consider to look at the age of the firewall, and it's probably appropriate to ask the question, is this still doing a job as effectively as it could? I think we have discussed putting in a test device to anyone who wants one that can actually scan your existing firewall to see if it's picking everything up, so that's always a possibility. Past the firewall, if it does get past the firewall, I would recommend you have antivirus on the servers and the PCs. Importantly, is it being kept up to date? Anti-spam stops any spam getting in from emails, and it protects the network that way, so it's important to have that in place. Patch management, again reiterating that ensuring your operating systems like your Windows servers, your Windows PCs, excuse me, your iOS devices, your Apple devices, your Android devices are on the latest security patch. This is a key one for me, the following two. Ensuring that you have a simple, understandable IT policy. I would challenge any of the listeners to go back and read their IT policy and come back and let us know if it is simple and easy to understand. It should be clear, concise, and giving guidance to your end users. After you have got a simple IT policy, it's important to have continuous end user education and highlighting any threats that someone like the FD might be notified to, or the IT manager might be notified. Share that with your colleagues and just please be aware of what's happening in today's environment. And finally, as the worst case scenario, if it does get past, if the virus and attack does get past all of those safety measures, always have an effective backup and recovery solution just in case it can't be recovered and you don't want to pay a ransom, which we never recommend. Then at least what we can do is recover from the latest backup, which really should be done minimum daily, but more often if it's sensitive and very critical information. So please do complete that checklist and let us know. We are offering a 10-minute vulnerability check, and please contact Amy if you'd be interested in that.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, I think today, first of all, yes, there's some scary stuff there, and thank you to her for being put on the spot with some of those questions. The purpose of today isn't to terrify you, but I guess that end user education is very important, and to make you aware of that as much as anything. You will have the facility to ask questions, so if anyone has any further questions, if you can make them a note in that message box on the right hand side, and we'll just hold fire for a couple of minutes just for anyone to voice those questions.
Have we got any questions, Amy?
I have received one. They want to know how it would affect their devices. Does it affect their devices, and is it just PCs?
Actually, there are not many attacks that happen on an iOS device or an Apple device. Can be quite secure, but we're seeing more and more of them now. Android devices, so phones we're talking about in both instances, are quite vulnerable, and we have seen a number of attacks. And again, Windows devices are still the most prevalent in businesses, so they are still vulnerable. I'm not saying Apple is bulletproof. We have seen attacks, but it's important to keep all your devices up to date and patched where possible.
And we've just received one question come in. They want to know exactly what does anti-spam do.
Okay, so anti-spam is a piece of intelligent software that you can either have on your server, which I don't recommend, because what you're doing is letting an email with a potential threat, or it might just be one about plastic surgery, or the typical one is Viagra, you might get in. What's happening is it's arriving on your site and it's being stopped by your anti-spam at the firewall, and then it's doing a lot of work to filter the good email from the bad email, and then it's sending it to you as an end user. What we always recommend is having hosted anti-spam, which means before the email even gets to you, off-site it's filtered and then it's forwarded to you. So anti-spam is that piece of software that cleans the real email from the spam email.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any other questions at that point?
I've just received one more, and that is, what is the difference between backup and disaster recovery?
Okay, well that's a brilliant question. Think of backup like taking a snapshot or taking some data and storing it somewhere else just in case. And a lot of backup solutions, all they're doing is backing up the data. To actually recover using that data would mean setting up a new server, going through that installation process. You probably remember as listeners, when you did set up your servers, it's quite a lengthy process. So we would then have to set up the servers again, install the correct settings and configurations, and once we have all the users, all the information in place, then we could put the data you'd backed up back into the server. Now that can take anything from a day to 5 days, depending on the complexity of your network. So if you lose a file, backup is brilliant because you can just go and get the file. If you lose your entire server or system, backup isn't brilliant because then you need to rebuild everything. What disaster recovery solutions do is they actually take a snapshot of the entire server and environment, and then it's quite easy to recover. Think of it like a photocopy of your entire system, and what we can do is take that photocopy and reapply it to any piece of hardware. We could loan you a server, you could buy a new one, and we could be back up and running in as little as 4 hours. Sometimes it's a lot quicker, but a lot of backup and disaster recovery solutions are one solution now, so it's important probably to check if you have something that can do both.
Okay, thank you. Don't think I've got any more questions.
Okay, so yes, I'd like to just finally say thank you very much. I hope today's been beneficial, and obviously you have our contact details. We will send you a copy of the slides via email, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, bye.